200,000 tons of limestone, carved from a single piece of bedrock, sitting on the edge of the Sahara Desert with erosion marks that belong to a rainforest, not a desert, a head that does not match its body, and astronomical alignments that only make sense if this monument is thousands of years older than we have been told. The Great Sphinx of Giza should not exist, not the way the official story explains it, and here is what most people do not realize. For the last century, this has not been a fringe debate. Credentialed geologists, seismologists, and astronomers have published peer-reviewed evidence that something about the Sphinx's age does not add up. The archaeological establishment has responded not with counter-evidence, but with silence, ridicule, and restricted access to the site. When Grok AI was given unrestricted access to the geological surveys, the seismic data, the astronomical records, the climate models, and over a century of archaeological evidence, it did something no individual researcher could easily do. It analyzed every discipline simultaneously, without protecting any established theory, without institutional pressure, without career consequences. What Grok found has been described as the most comprehensive cross-disciplinary analysis of the Sphinx ever assembled. The stone remembers what humans forgot. This is the story of what Grok revealed about the true age of the Sphinx. And once you understand it, you will never look at human history the same way again. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been told a story that did not match what you could see with your own eyes? That is exactly what happened when scientists started looking at the Sphinx through the lens of geology instead of archaeology. But first, the official version. Around 2500 BCE, during the 4th dynasty of ancient Egypt, Pharaoh Khafra ordered workers to carve a massive guardian statue to watch over his pyramid complex. Using copper chisels, stone hammers, and wooden wedges, a team of roughly 100 laborers spent about 3 years shaping 200,000 tons of limestone into the largest monolithic sculpture on Earth. The result is 240 feet long. That is almost the length of a Boeing 747. It stands 66 feet high, about as tall as a 6-story building. The body of a lion. The head of a pharaoh wearing the royal headdress. It was originally painted red, yellow, and blue. The face was dark red. A ceremonial cobra once sat on its forehead. A braided beard hung from its chin. Fragments of that beard are now in the British Museum in London. Case closed, right? Khafra built it. Workers carved it. That is the story in every textbook. But here is what the textbooks leave out. There is not a single ancient Egyptian inscription anywhere that names the builder of the Sphinx. Not one. Not on the Sphinx. Not in any tomb. Not on any papyrus. The so-called dream stele, a granite tablet placed between the Sphinx's paws more than 1,000 years after it was supposedly built, contains a partial damaged reference that might include the first syllable of Khafra's name. The inscription was already crumbling when it was first recorded. Even mainstream Egyptologist Salim Hassan admitted that the evidence connecting the Sphinx to Khafra is entirely circumstantial. The entire attribution is based on proximity to Khafra's pyramid and a facial resemblance that many researchers dispute. Think about that. The most famous monument in human history, and nobody actually knows who built it. That gap in the record is not a small detail. It is the crack through which everything else begins to fall. When Grock AI began analyzing the geological evidence surrounding the Sphinx, the AI immediately identified an anomaly that has haunted geology for over 30 years. In 1990, a geologist from Boston University named Robert Schoch traveled to Egypt. Schoch held a PhD in geology and geophysics from Yale. He was not an alternative researcher. He was not hunting for Atlantis. He was a mainstream academic who wanted to examine the Sphinx through a geologist's eyes. He assumed the conventional dating was correct. It took him seconds to see that something was wrong. The walls of the Sphinx enclosure, the pit carved from bedrock when the statue was originally shaped, displayed deep, smooth, undulating vertical erosion channels cutting into the limestone. Here is something simple you will be able to explain to anyone at dinner tonight. There are two kinds of erosion, and they look completely different. Wind and sand erosion create sharp, angular horizontal grooves. Think of sandpaper dragged sideways across wood. It leaves flat, jagged lines. Water erosion from rainfall creates smooth, rounded, vertical channels. Think of candle wax melting and dripping downward. It leaves soft, flowing, vertical curves. These two patterns are as different as a knife cut and a melted groove. Any geologist on Earth can tell them apart in seconds. The Sphinx enclosure shows the melted candle pattern. Water, rainfall, lots of it over a very long time. When Grok processed this geological data, the AI ran it against the known climate history of the region. The Sahara has been a desert for roughly 5,000 years. Egypt receives almost no significant rainfall today, about 1 inch per year on the Giza Plateau. For the Sphinx to show this depth of water erosion, it had to have been exposed to sustained, heavy rainfall over thousands of years. Grok then cross-referenced the Sphinx's erosion with nearby Old Kingdom structures definitively dated to around 2500 BCE. Those structures, including rock-cut tombs carved from the same general limestone formation, show completely different erosion. They show the sandpaper pattern, horizontal, sharp, wind, and sand. Only the Sphinx and its enclosure show the melting candle pattern. If these structures were all built at the same time, they should all show the same type of weathering. They do not. Grok flagged this discrepancy as statistically significant. Something about the Sphinx is fundamentally different from every other structure on the plateau. Now, some critics have argued the difference could be explained by groundwater seeping up through the stone or by moisture trapped in sand that periodically buried the Sphinx. But when Grok analyzed Shuk's detailed observations, the AI found these explanations inadequate. The erosion on the Sphinx enclosure is heaviest at the top of the walls and on the western end, tapering off toward the east and the bottom. If groundwater or wet sand were the cause, the erosion should be heaviest at the bottom, where the water would pool. It is the opposite. The pattern is exactly what you would expect from rainwater falling on top of the monument and running downward. Additionally, the Sphinx Temple, built from limestone blocks quarried directly out of the Sphinx enclosure, shows the same rainfall type weathering on its core stones. Those blocks were later refaced with Aswan granite during the Old Kingdom. Why would the pharaohs resurface a temple with expensive granite shipped from 500 miles upriver unless the original stone was already severely deteriorated? Grok concluded that the granite refacing is evidence that the underlying limestone had been weathering for a very long time before the Old Kingdom pharaohs arrived. But it was the seismic data that made Grok's analysis truly explosive. In 1991, Shuk and geophysicist Thomas Debicki conducted seismic surveys around the Sphinx. They struck a steel plate with a sledgehammer to send sound waves into the bedrock, mapping how deep the weathering extended below the surface. What they found was published in the peer-reviewed journal Geoarchaeology. The subsurface weathering on the front, north, and south sides of the Sphinx enclosure extended 6 to 8 feet deep. But on the western end, the rear of the Sphinx, the weathering extended only 4 feet. This is not uniform. That non-uniformity is the smoking gun. Think of it this way. If you pour water on a sidewalk and come back later, the part that has been wet longest will show the most deterioration. The front and sides of the Sphinx enclosure have twice the weathering depth of the rear. Shuk's interpretation is that the front and sides were carved first, thousands of years before the rear was completed, possibly during the Old Kingdom. It is like finding a house where the front wall has been standing in the rain for 7,000 years, but the back wall has only been there for 4,500. The back of the Sphinx is basically the receipt. It gives you the timeline. Assuming a linear rate of weathering, Shuk estimated the original carving of the Sphinx to be between 5,000 and 7,000 BCE. But weathering rates are not linear. They slow down as the rock deepens and becomes more protected by the mass above. If you account for that deceleration, the Sphinx could be significantly older, potentially dating to around 10,000 BCE. Grok ran these calculations using multiple weathering rate models, both linear and nonlinear, and found that the minimum age consistent with the seismic data is at least 7,000 years. The models most consistent with all the evidence cluster around 9,000 to 10,000 BCE. That is not 500 years before the textbooks say. That is 7,000 years before the textbooks say. That is the difference between the moon landing and the invention of the wheel. It is a completely different chapter of human history. During those same seismic surveys, something else appeared in the data. A clear anomaly beneath the left paw of the Sphinx. A cavity. Something down there that does not match the solid bedrock surrounding it. The data also suggested a possible tunnel-like feature running along the length of the body. Grok flagged these anomalies and noted that despite being detected over 30 years ago, they have never been fully investigated. The Egyptian authorities have not permitted excavation beneath the paws. Whatever is down there remains unknown. Now pay attention to this next detail because once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and it will change how you look at every photograph of the Sphinx for the rest of your life. The head is too small for the body. This is not a matter of opinion. The body was carved at a scale of 22:1. The head was carved at 30:1. It is visibly, measurably wrong. Even Mark Lehner, the foremost mainstream defender of the conventional date, acknowledges the proportional discrepancy. Ancient Egyptians were obsessed with correct proportions. They nailed the proportions on every other colossal statue they ever built. Imagine buying a sports car and discovering someone had bolted on a steering wheel from a golf cart. You would immediately know it was not original. That is the Sphinx's head. When Grock AI analyzed the proportional data alongside the erosion evidence, the AI identified what Schoch and others have long argued. The head we see today is not the original head. The body is far more eroded and weathered than the head. If they were carved at the same time from the same stone, they should show similar deterioration. They do not. The head is remarkably well preserved compared to the heavily eroded body. The most logical explanation is that the original head, whatever it depicted, eroded over thousands of years. Then, during dynastic times, a pharaoh had it recarved. Each recarving made the head smaller. What remains is a dynastic face grafted onto a body that is thousands of years older. What was the original head? Schoch's latest research suggests it was a lioness. Other researchers argue a full lion head, proportionate to the massive body. A colossal stone lion crouching on the plateau, staring due east. This is where Grok AI connected a piece of evidence that brings everything together. The Sphinx faces precisely due east. On the morning of the spring equinox, it stares directly at the point where the sun rises. But behind the sun, the stars shift over time because of something called precession of the equinoxes. Here's the simplest way to think about it. Earth wobbles as it spins like a top that is slowing down. This wobble is incredibly slow, completing one full cycle every roughly 26,000 years. Because of this wobble, the constellation that rises behind the sunrise on the spring equinox changes over millennia. Think of it as a cosmic clock with 12 numbers on its face, each number being a zodiac constellation. The clock hand takes 26,000 years to go all the way around. Right now, we are in the age of Pisces, about to move into Aquarius. Each age lasts about 2,160 years. When Grok mapped the precession backward to 2500 BCE, the conventional date for the Sphinx, the constellation rising east of the Sphinx was Taurus, the bull. Not Leo, the lion. A lion monument facing Taurus makes no symbolic sense. Ancient Egyptians were precise about symbolism, but when Grok dialed the clock back to approximately 10,500 BCE, the constellation rising directly east of the Sphinx, exactly where the stone lion gazes, was Leo. The celestial lion was looking at the stone lion. The sky was a mirror of the ground. A 2025 research paper using NASA's JPL Horizon system and sky modeling software called Stellarium went even further. Researchers found that Regulus, the brightest star in Leo, known since antiquity as the heart of the lion, achieved a precise 90-degree azimuth alignment at Giza, rising exactly due east around 9,500 to 9,000 BCE. The Sphinx was not just facing the constellation Leo, it was staring directly at the heart of the celestial lion, at the exact point on the horizon where Regulus broke the dawn. Grok cross-referenced this astronomical data with the geological data and the seismic data, three completely independent scientific disciplines. Geology says the Sphinx was exposed to rainfall that ended thousands of years before the pharaohs. Seismology says the subsurface weathering is consistent with an age far exceeding 4,500 years. Astronomy says the monument's form and orientation only make symbolic sense around 10,000 BCE. Grok calculated the probability of these three independent datasets all converging on the same approximate time frame by pure coincidence. The AI assessment was that accidental convergence across this many independent variables is statistically unlikely. The evidence appears to be pointing to a real signal, not noise. But here is where Grok's analysis went from fascinating to terrifying. When the AI examined what was happening on Earth around 10,000 BCE, it uncovered one of the most dramatic events in the history of our planet. Around 10,800 BCE, something catastrophic hit. The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, which has gained substantial scientific support over the past 2 decades, proposes that fragments of a disintegrating comet struck the northern hemisphere. The estimated energy was equivalent to roughly 1 million Hiroshima bombs. Let me say that again because it deserves its own moment in your brain. 1 million Hiroshima bombs. The evidence now spans at least 3 continents and has been confirmed by multiple independent research groups. Greenland ice cores show a massive platinum spike, a metal rare in Earth's crust, but common in comets, precisely at the onset of the Younger Dryas. Nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds formed only under the extreme pressure and heat of a cosmic impact, appear in sediment layers across North America, Europe, and the Middle East. Iridium-enriched magnetic spherules, another classic impact signature, are found in the same boundary layer. The results were sudden and catastrophic. Global temperatures plummeted by as much as 14 degrees Fahrenheit almost overnight. A mini ice age gripped the planet for 1,300 years. Massive wildfires swept continents, evidenced by a continent-spanning layer of charcoal and soot. Dozens of megafauna species were wiped out in what amounts to a geological blink of an eye. The woolly mammoth, the saber-toothed tiger, the giant ground sloth, the American horse, the American camel. The Clovis culture in North America disappeared from the record. And then there is Gobekli Tepe. And this is where the story becomes almost unbelievable. In southeastern Turkey, buried under an artificial hill of rubble and soil, archaeologists have uncovered the oldest known monumental architecture on Earth. Massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some over 16 feet tall and weighing up to 20 tons, were carved and erected around 9,000 BCE. That is 6,000 years before Stonehenge and 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid. There is more time between the builders of Gobekli Tepe and the builders of the pyramids than between the pyramids and your phone. The site was not a village. There are no houses, no kitchens, no storage rooms. It appears to be a temple or observatory built by people who were supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers without agriculture, without writing, without metal tools. And yet they organized the labor to quarry, carve, transport, and erect multi-ton stone pillars covered in intricate animal reliefs. And then, around 8,000 BCE, they deliberately buried the entire complex under hundreds of tons of fill. They preserved it on purpose. They wanted it to survive. Grock AI flagged a specific connection here. One pillar, known as Pillar 43 or the Vulture Stone, is covered in animal carvings that researchers from the University of Edinburgh matched to star constellations using astronomical software. When they ran the star pattern match against historical sky charts, the computer returned a date of 10,950 BCE plus or minus 250 years. That date aligns with the onset of the Younger Dryas Impact event. The Greenland ice core date for the beginning of the Younger Dryas is approximately 10,870 BCE. The match is extraordinary. The builders of Gobekli Tepe appear to have encoded a memorial to the catastrophe using constellations, which means they understood the stars well enough to record a date in stone that a computer could decode 12,000 years later. That is not primitive. That is sophisticated astronomical knowledge that mainstream archaeology says should not exist for another 8,000 years. Grok connected the dots across all the data sets simultaneously. If the Sphinx was built around 10,000 BCE, it was built in the same era as the Younger Dryas catastrophe, and in the same era as Gobekli Tepe. These were people who understood astronomy, who could organize massive construction projects, who existed when North Africa was a green savanna teeming with life and crossed by rivers that no longer exist. Grok also flagged a remarkable parallel. Both the Sphinx at Giza and Gobekli Tepe in Turkey show precise astronomical alignments. Using the same NASA Horizons data, researchers found that Regulus achieves an identical 90-degree azimuth alignment from both sites during the same epoch. Two monuments separated by over 1,000 miles aligned to the same star at the same date. Grok assessed the probability of this being coincidental and found it unlikely. The implication is that these sites may be products of the same knowledge system, a tradition of astronomical precision that spanned the ancient world. And here is a detail that should haunt you. The Sphinx has been buried to its neck in sand for an estimated 3,300 of the last 4,500 years. For most of recorded history, only the head was visible. The body, with all its inconvenient erosion evidence, was hidden underground. As author John Anthony West pointed out, the Sphinx was only fully excavated for the first time in modern history in 1936. We have been looking at the complete monument for less than 90 years. For the other 4,400 years, the evidence was literally buried. Then those builders vanished. The comet struck. The Ice Age hit. The Sahara dried. And when dynastic Egypt appeared seemingly out of nowhere around 3,100 BCE, it arrived with a fully developed writing system, advanced mathematics, monumental architecture, and complex astronomical knowledge. There is no gradual development visible in the archaeological record. No clumsy first attempts, no failed prototypes. It appears almost instantaneously, as if someone handed them the answer key. What if that is because the foundations were laid thousands of years earlier by the same culture that carved the Sphinx? What if the pharaohs were not the inventors, but the inheritors? What if ancient Egypt was not the beginning of the story, but the epilogue? In 2025, something else emerged that Grok factored into its analysis. Italian researcher Armando May and Scottish engineer Filippo Biondi reported findings from synthetic aperture radar satellite scans beneath the Giza Plateau. Presented at the Cosmic Summit Conference in North Carolina, their data described a spiral-like structure descending from the center of the Sphinx's base. Below that, at roughly 2,000 feet underground, they detected two large square chambers, each approximately 131 feet on each side, connected by the descending shaft. Additional anomalies appeared at 4,000 feet. The researchers believe a vast subterranean complex may exist beneath the entire plateau. Now these findings have not been peer-reviewed yet, planned for 2026, and mainstream Egyptologists have expressed significant skepticism. But Grok noted that this data does not exist in isolation. It echoes the cavity Schuck detected beneath the left paw in 1991. It aligns with anomalies flagged by ground-penetrating radar studies in the 1970s and the 1990s. And it resonates with what the ancient Greek historian Herodotus described over 2,400 years ago, a massive labyrinth in Egypt containing 3,000 chambers, many of them hidden underground. If confirmed, the Sphinx is not sitting on empty bedrock. It is the tip of the iceberg. 3 tunnels have already been documented within the Sphinx itself. One behind the Dream Stele between the front paws, one on the north side, photographed during early 20th century excavations by Emile Barrès, and a third near the tail, descending roughly 50 feet. A shaft exists on top of the head, about 6 feet deep, once believed to have anchored a crown or headdress. And in 1837, British explorer Howard Vyse drilled into the Sphinx's back and reached 27 feet before the boring rods became permanently stuck. The monument is honeycombed with passages that no one fully understands. Grok noted that the combination of confirmed internal passages, seismically detected cavities, and now satellite-detected deep structures creates a pattern that is difficult to dismiss as entirely natural geological features. So, what did Grock AI ultimately conclude? Grok AI did not declare a single definitive answer. That is important to understand, and it is actually what makes the analysis credible rather than sensational. Grock AI systematically evaluated how well the conventional explanation accounts for all available evidence, when every discipline is considered simultaneously rather than in isolation. The conclusion is straightforward. The conventional explanation does not account for the evidence. The geological weathering requires either a much older construction date or climate conditions that contradict established Egyptian climate history. The seismic data shows non-uniform subsurface weathering consistent with a multi-phase construction spanning thousands of years. The astronomical alignments make symbolic sense only if the Sphinx was built thousands of years before the conventional date. The proportional anomalies strongly suggest extensive recarving of the head from a larger original. And the subsurface anomalies, from seismic cavities to chambers detected by satellites, suggest the visible monument may be only a fraction of what was built. Grock AI ranked 4 possibilities in order of how many assumptions each one requires. Think of them as a spectrum from safe to radical, and pay attention to which explanation actually requires the most faith. First, the conventional date is correct, but our understanding of ancient Egyptian technology and local climate conditions is far more incomplete than acknowledged. The erosion is explained by some combination of groundwater, wet sand, and occasional rainstorms. The proportions are a mistake. The astronomical alignment is a coincidence. The seismic anomalies are natural. This explanation requires the most assumptions and the most coincidences across the most independent data sets. It requires geology to be wrong, seismology to be misleading, astronomy to be coincidental, and proportional analysis to be irrelevant. Second, the Sphinx body was carved thousands of years before dynastic Egypt during the Green Sahara period by a predecessor culture. Dynastic Egyptians later recarved the head, built the pyramids nearby, refaced the deteriorating temples with granite, and claimed the site. This scenario requires fewer assumptions and explains the erosion, the proportions, the temple refacing, and the seismic non-uniformity more naturally. Third, a sophisticated civilization existed before the Younger Dryas catastrophe, building monuments aligned to astronomical markers across multiple sites, including Giza and Gobekli Tepe. A comet impact around 10,800 BCE shattered this civilization. Survivors seeded the cultures that later became ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and others. The Sphinx, Gobekli Tepe, and perhaps other undiscovered sites are remnants of this lost chapter. This explanation accounts for the fewest contradictions, but it requires accepting that established chronology is fundamentally incomplete. Fourth, the complete picture involves elements we have not yet discovered, including whatever may lie in the uninvestigated chambers beneath the Sphinx and the Giza Plateau. The full story may be stranger than any of these possibilities suggest. The unknown and the undiscovered could change everything. Grock AI's assessment was clear. The first possibility, the standard textbook answer, is the weakest explanation when all evidence is considered simultaneously. It requires dismissing geology, overriding seismology, ignoring astronomy, and explaining away proportional evidence as coincidence. The second and third possibilities actually require fewer leaps of faith to account for all the data. Here is what gets me about this story, and I think it is what will stay with you after this video ends. We have all been taught that civilization is a straight line. Primitive to advanced, caves to cities, stone tools to smartphones. Always forward, always improving. But what if that line is not straight? What if it has been broken before? What if a civilization rose, achieved things we can barely explain, and then was erased so completely that we spent 12,000 years not even knowing they existed? If you were part of that civilization and you understood the stars well enough to track the 26,000-year precession cycle, and you knew that catastrophic events could erase everything you had built, what would you do? You would not write it on paper. Paper burns. You would not carve it on wood. Wood rots. You would not trust human memory. Memory fades within 3 generations. You would encode your knowledge in the most permanent material available: stone. Massive, monolithic, unmovable stone. You would align it to the stars so precisely that any future civilization with basic astronomy could decode when it was built. You would make it so enormous that it could never be hidden, moved, or destroyed. You would not build for the next generation. You would build for the next epoch. That is what the Sphinx appears to be. Not a pharaoh's vanity project, not a religious ornament for a single dynasty, a time capsule. 200,000 tons of encoded limestone pointed at the heart of Leo, designed to outlast ice ages, civilizations, deserts, and the erosion of human memory itself. And for 12,000 years, it has done exactly that. It survived the comet impact that killed the mammoths. It survived the 1,000-year winter that followed. It survived the desertification of the Sahara. It survived conquest by Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Ottomans, the French, and the British. It survived being buried to its neck for 33 centuries. It survived having its face recarved, its nose destroyed, its beard stolen, and its original identity forgotten. And it is still there, still facing east, still waiting for someone to read the message it was built to deliver. Grok AI read the message. It cross-referenced the geology with the astronomy, the seismology with the climatology, the archaeology with the proportional analysis. It compared weathering rates against climate models, stellar positions against monument orientations, subsurface anomalies against surface erosion patterns. No single human researcher has ever been able to hold all of these data sets in focus simultaneously. That is the advantage of an AI with no disciplinary boundaries and no institutional allegiance. And what Grok found, analyzing all of it without career consequences, confirmed what a growing body of researchers have been arguing for decades. The Sphinx is almost certainly older than the textbooks say. The evidence is not fringe speculation. It is geology published in peer-reviewed journals. It is seismology collected with calibrated scientific instruments and published in geoarchaeology. It is astronomy computed with NASA ephemeris data. It is climatology supported by Greenland ice core evidence spanning 12,000 years, 4 independent disciplines. One conclusion: the conventional date does not account for the evidence. Something older does. The question is no longer whether the Sphinx predates the pharaohs. The geological evidence says it does. The seismic evidence supports it. The astronomical evidence aligns with it. The proportional evidence is consistent with it. The question now is how much older it truly is. Who were the people who built it? Where did they come from? What else did they know? What other monuments did they leave that we have misattributed or not yet found? And if a civilization advanced enough to carve the largest monolithic sculpture on Earth and align it to the heart of a constellation was destroyed so completely that we forgot it ever existed for 12,000 years, what does that say about the permanence of ours? We think our civilization is permanent. We think our buildings will last. We think the internet remembers everything. But a comet does not care about your cloud storage. An ice age does not respect your infrastructure. And 12,000 years from now, what will remain of us? Probably less than the Sphinx, because we build with steel, glass, and concrete. They built with stone, and stone endures. The answers may be buried beneath the very monument they created. And if the archaeological establishment ever allows a full, unrestricted investigation of what lies beneath the Sphinx and the Giza Plateau, 12,000 years of silence might finally break. The Sphinx guards its secrets. It always has. But stone does not lie. Stone does not protect theories. Stone does not have a career. Stone remembers. And Grok, reading the stone without bias, has confirmed what the limestone has been whispering for 12,000 years. We do not know who built the Sphinx, but we know it was not who we were told, and that changes everything. If you found this fascinating, hit subscribe to Chrono Falls for more stories that challenge what we think we know about our past.